Before capture ever crossed their minds, German soldiers carried with them a picture of America that had been painted by years of Nazi propaganda. In posters, films, and radio broadcasts, the United States was portrayed as a chaotic land of jazz clubs, consumerism, and weakness. Germans were told that Americans had no discipline, no stomach for hardship, and no seriousness for war. It was said that America's soldiers were soft boys playing at war, pampered by a life of luxury and indulgence. Propaganda ministers under Joseph Goebbels emphasized this message relentlessly. They described American society as fractured, a patchwork of immigrants with no real unity or shared purpose. The United States, they claimed, might have factories and resources, but lacked the resolve to use them effectively. It was easy, the propaganda insisted, to imagine such a people collapsing at the first true taste of suffering. Magazines and speeches painted Americans as distracted by movies, cigarettes, chewing gum, and frivolous entertainment, while the serious German soldier devoted himself to duty, sacrifice, and the fatherland. In this carefully constructed image, the Americans could not possibly match the precision, toughness, and determination of German forces. Even the mighty US industry was mocked as clumsy and inefficient, compared to the engineering genius of German tanks, planes, and weapons. For many German officers, these messages hardened into certainty. They stepped onto battlefields in France, North Africa, and Russia with absolute belief that they faced an inferior enemy. America, to them, was a nation of weak civilians playing at soldiery. This belief was not just arrogance, it was armor. It reassured them that their sacrifices had meaning, that Germany's fight was righteous, and that victory was inevitable. Little did they know that same worldview would soon be shattered in captivity. The sense of superiority was not built on propaganda alone. Early battlefield triumphs seemed to confirm every claim. In 1940, the rapid fall of France shocked the world and emboldened German confidence. Blitzkrieg tactics, with tanks and aircraft working in devastating coordination, had crushed armies that were thought to be formidable. To the German officer corps, this was proof that their training, discipline, and technology stood unmatched. The Balkans campaign reinforced this arrogance. In quick succession, Yugoslavia and Greece fell under German pressure, adding more victories to the tally. These lightning campaigns suggested that wherever German armor rolled, resistance was futile. Each win fed into the belief that Germany was destined to dominate Europe, perhaps even the world. By the time Rommel's Afrika Korps pushed deep into North Africa, German soldiers believed themselves nearly invincible. They saw British forces retreat, entire units surrender, and armored columns buckle under German assault. When whispers spread that America might eventually join the war, German veterans scoffed. If Britain, with its long history of empire, could be driven back, what chance did a soft America have? Every victory layered confidence upon confidence. Officers and enlisted men alike absorbed the message that German skill and toughness outclassed any rival. Arrogance was not simply encouraged from above, it was reinforced by lived experience on the battlefield. The Americans, they were certain, would never stand a chance. What no one realized at the time was that these assumptions, forged in the glow of early triumphs, would make the contrast with captivity in the United States all the more shocking. For German prisoners of war, the first shock came not in a camp but during the journey there. Captured in North Africa, Italy, and later in France, they expected transport under brutal conditions, cattle cars, filth, and neglect. That was how prisoners were often moved in Europe, and they assumed their fate in American hands would be no different, perhaps worse. Instead, what greeted them defied every expectation. The trains that carried them across the United States were unlike anything they had imagined. Instead of hard wooden benches or standing room cars, they were guided into compartments with padded seats, windows, and even proper ventilation. Some cars had dining facilities where meals were served on trays, hot food prepared for men who just days earlier had been fighting against the very country now feeding them. The POWs whispered among themselves, bewildered. Was this a trick? A temporary kindness to lower their guard? But the treatment remained consistent, humane, orderly, and shockingly comfortable. Guards did not bark orders unnecessarily or beat them into submission. Instead, they kept firm discipline while maintaining a strange sense of respect. For soldiers raised on tales of America's weakness and moral decay, the sight of a well-organized transport system carrying thousands of enemy soldiers in relative comfort was unsettling. It clashed violently with everything they had been taught. The journey was not the humiliation they expected, it was a revelation. If America could treat its enemies this way, what did that say about the nation's true strength? The long ride across the glowing countryside would be the first hint that captivity in America would not resemble anything German troops had been prepared for. And in that realization, the first cracks in propaganda began to show. As the trains rolled deeper into the American heartland, the German prisoners pressed their faces to the windows. What they saw outside was as jarring as the comfort inside. Town after town glowed brightly in the night, streets lit with rows of electric lamps, houses illuminated warmly, shops and diners still buzzing with activity, even after dark. Neon signs flickered above storefronts, and cars moved steadily along roads without any sign of fuel shortage. For men accustomed to life in Germany, the contrast was staggering. At home, entire cities were forced into blackouts to evade Allied bombers. Windows were covered, street lamps extinguished, and movement after dark was wrapped in silence and fear. Even before the heaviest bombing campaigns, German towns had grown used to scarcity, rationed fuel, dimmed lights, and nights that seemed unnaturally dark. To see an enemy nation wasting light so casually, as though war had barely touched it, felt almost unreal. Some POWs muttered that it was impossible, that perhaps they had been transported through select areas to deceive them. Yet as the miles passed and the glowing scenes continued, disbelief turned into uneasy recognition. This abundance was real. America had resources to spare, even in wartime. The prisoners exchanged anxious glances. If the country could keep its towns glowing and its trains running while fighting a war on multiple fronts, what did that mean for its true capacity to wage war? For the first time, many began to question the propaganda they had once accepted without. The bright lights of small-town America did more than illuminate streets. They illuminated a reality the Germans had been told could not exist, and with every glowing lamp-post, their certainty in victory dimmed a little further. If the trains and glowing towns had unsettled the German prisoners, what they learned about American industry left them staggered. In Germany, they had been told repeatedly that the Reich's engineering was unmatched, that its factories produced the finest tanks, aircraft and artillery in the world. Yet when POWs were shown films and reports of American shipyards, they saw a scale of production that bordered on the unbelievable. The Liberty ship was the perfect symbol of this industrial machine, a merchant vessel large enough to carry tanks, trucks, and supplies across oceans. It was being built at a speed that defied logic. Some were completed in less than 2 weeks. One famously launched in just 4.5 days. For men who came from a nation where a single U-boat or tank required painstaking time and resources, the idea that America could churn out entire fleets in days was disorienting. But the ships were only one piece of the puzzle. Films showed the supply chains feeding them, cranes loading mountains of crates, endless rail lines carrying raw materials, and ports stacked high with goods. The sheer scale of movement, food, fuel, weapons, medical supplies was unlike anything German soldiers had ever seen. To them, war was a constant fight against scarcity, engines without fuel, weapons without spare parts, soldiers without enough food. Now staring at the screen in POW camps or hearing stories from guards, they realized America fought a different kind of war, not of rationing but of overwhelming supply. The Liberty ships were not miracles. They were products of a system designed to outproduce any enemy. For many POWs, this was the first undeniable proof that Germany could not hope to match America's strength. The war was not only being fought on the battlefield, it was being won in the factory. If the Liberty ships revealed America's overwhelming capacity, the everyday details of its workers revealed something even more unsettling for German POWs. It wasn't just the factories that stunned them. It was the lives of the people who kept those factories running. American shipyard and assembly line workers arrived in their own cars, parked in neat rows outside the gates. For German soldiers who had marched long miles or fought over dwindling fuel, The idea that ordinary laborers could each own a personal automobile felt unreal. In Germany, even many officers had no such luxury, and fuel was rationed to the point of scarcity. Inside the gates, the contrast grew sharper. Workers wore sturdy boots, clean clothes, and protective gear issued freely by their employer. To the POWs, this was wealth on display, not in grand palaces, but in the everyday comfort of ordinary citizens. Even their lunches became symbols of prosperity. American workers opened lunch pails filled with sandwiches, layered thick with meat, fresh fruit, and even dessert. For Germans who had grown used to watery soup and hard bread, these meals looked extravagant. It was not just the food, clothes, or cars. It was what they represented, a society where abundance flowed downward, where even the average worker lived at a standard higher than German elite. For men who had believed the Nazi message that America was weak and divided, this revelation struck deeply. The POWs could not escape the comparison. If America treated its workers so well while waging war across the globe, what chance did Germany have? For the German prisoners, captivity had already been filled with disorienting surprises: comfortable trains, endless food, glowing towns, and factories beyond imagination. Yet nothing prepared them for the evening when camp guards casually announced that a film would be shown. At first, many POWs thought it was a trick, or perhaps some sort of interrogation tactic. The idea that captives would be invited to sit together and watch a movie seemed absurd, even insulting to their sense of what war should mean. But as the sun set, they were led to a hall where a projector had been set up. Rows of benches filled the space, and soon reels began to click and whir. On the screen flickered the first images, black and white scenes from an American production. Some POWs sat stiffly, arms crossed as if refusing to take part in this strange ritual. Others leaned forward, curiosity overcoming skepticism. The experience itself was unlike anything they had known. In Germany, cinemas had been rationed to civilians and tightly controlled by propaganda ministries. Films were not entertainment but indoctrination. Here, in the heart of an enemy's land, the Germans were stunned to find themselves treated not as enemies but as an audience. They were given the same chance as anyone else to sit in the dark and lose themselves in story. The atmosphere was surreal. Guards leaned casually against walls, some even laughing at scenes on the screen, while the prisoners sat in silence, trying to process what was happening. For men who had expected punishment and deprivation, the offer of leisure felt like an assault on their beliefs. When the projector's light washed over them, it illuminated more than a film. It revealed the vast gulf between what they had been told about America and what America actually was. The first minutes of the film passed in uneasy silence. The German prisoners stared at the glowing screen, unsure how to react. Then something unexpected happened. Laughter broke out, first from a few guards, then from the prisoners themselves. It wasn't forced or nervous. It was genuine amusement at a joke, a slapstick moment, or a witty exchange in the film. For men who had been hardened by years of war, the sudden burst of laughter felt almost unnatural. Some POWs exchanged glances as if asking one another whether this was really happening. Their disbelief was palpable. They had been told America was a land of decadence, obsessed with trivial pleasures, too soft to fight a real war. And yet here they were, watching a film filled with life and humor while American soldiers fought across oceans without pause. Others grew curious, leaning forward on their benches. The story on the screen was not propaganda. It wasn't trying to convince them of anything, nor did it demonize enemy. It was simply entertainment, offered freely, even to men who only weeks earlier had fought against the country projecting it. That freedom to laugh, to be entertained, to forget for a moment the harshness of the world, that was the real show. By the end of the screening, the hall was filled with a low buzz of conversation. Some POWs admitted quietly to one another that the experience had unsettled them more than weapons or battles. If America could afford to share laughter with its prisoners, what did that say about its strength? For many, the movie was not just a distraction. It was the first crack in the belief that Nazi propaganda had built. If the first screening had unsettled the German POWs, the films that followed only deepened the effect. Week after week, the guards rolled in the projector, and the prisoners found themselves exposed to something they had never expected: a steady stream of American cinema. There were newsreels showing the vast machinery of war, columns of tanks stretching for miles, bombers filling the sky, Liberty ships sliding down shipyard ramps one after another. The prisoners watched in silence as they realized that these were not exaggerated claims, but filmed evidence of industrial might beyond imagination. Then came comedies. The slapstick antics of actors like Abbott and Costello drew laughter even from men who had sworn not to show weakness. Their humor needed no translation. The physical comedy, the exaggerated expressions, the absurd scenarios transcended language barriers. For men accustomed to propaganda films, meant to harden and indoctrinate, the sheer frivolity of American comedy was both shocking and oddly comforting. And then there were westerns. Cowboys rode across wide-open landscapes, revolvers flashing under the endless sky. To the German prisoners, these films revealed something deeper than entertainment. They displayed a culture built on vast space, freedom of movement and a sense of individual daring that clashed directly with the rigid order of Nazi ideology. The West seemed limitless, untamed, and filled with possibility, so different from the crowded cities and rationed lives they had left behind. Each film, whether comedy, newsreel, or Western, became a window into the American soul. The POWs began to grasp that cinema here was not just a tool of the state, it was a reflection of society itself, open, creative, and confident enough to laugh, to dream, and to share even with enemies. For many prisoners, the realization was unsettling. For others, it was liberating. The contrast with the films they had grown up on in Germany could not have been sharper. Back home, every reel that flickered across a cinema screen had been tightly controlled by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. German films carried one message: loyalty to the Reich, obedience to the Führer, and hatred for the enemy. Even when disguised as entertainment, every scene carried a political undertone, every line of dialogue crafted to serve the state. In captivity, however, the German POWs discovered something entirely foreign: films without an agenda. The comedies didn't mock enemies or glorify war. The westerns weren't telling men whom to hate or whom to fear. The newsreels didn't demand blind loyalty. They simply documented, often casually, the sheer scale of American strength. For men accustomed to manipulation, this raw and often light-hearted storytelling felt disarming. Some prisoners whispered among themselves, "These films are dangerous," not because they were filled with subversion, but because they revealed a society that trusted its people with freedom of thought. To laugh at a clownish comedy or to admire a cowboy's independence was to step, however briefly, outside the mental cage they had lived in for years. Many found themselves reflecting almost uncomfortably on how different their own youth had been. Cinemas filled with stiff, ideological tales meant to remind them of duty and destiny. Now, sitting in a prison thousands of miles from home, they were learning that films could be something else entirely. A mirror of life, not a weapon of control. The effect was subtle but profound. Each reel loosened the grip of propaganda, just a little more. One of the greatest shocks came when the German prisoners realized that American films didn't just entertain, they often mocked their own leaders. In Germany, the very idea was unthinkable. No director would have dared to poke fun at Hitler, Goebbels, or any figure of authority. To do so would mean prison, or worse. The Nazi state demanded reverence, demanded that its leaders be presented as flawless giants. But in the camp screenings, the POWs saw something they could scarcely believe. American presidents, politicians, and generals lampooned in cartoons and comedy. Animated shorts showed caricatures of leaders with exaggerated features, bumbling through silly scenarios. Satirical routines made fun of political blunders, turning even powerful men into the butt of jokes. To German eyes, it was nothing short of astonishing. How could a society tolerate such ridicule without collapsing into chaos? The laughter of American guards in the back of the screening hall made the point even clearer. This was normal. In the United States, criticism and humor at the expense of leaders were not acts of treason, but signs of freedom. For the prisoners, it was both disorienting and strangely compelling. They had been told that democracy was weak because it lacked discipline. Yet here was proof that Americans could laugh at authority and still march into battle with confidence and unity. Some POWs admitted privately that the ridicule seemed like strength, not weakness. It showed that Americans were not afraid of ideas, not afraid of mockery, and certainly not afraid of debate. That realization began to gnaw at the carefully built edifice of Nazi propaganda. The more films they watched, the clearer the contrast became. In German theaters, every reel had been carefully engineered to reinforce unity under the Reich. Nothing was left to chance. There were no cracks in the facade, no mistakes admitted, no hint that Germany could falter. It was a world of illusions built for obedience. In America's films, however, the prisoners saw something entirely different. Stories that admitted flaws, questioned motives, even criticized the very society that produced them. Newsreels covered strikes in factories or political debates in Congress. Comedies poked fun at ordinary life, not by pretending everything was perfect but by highlighting imperfections everyone could recognize. Even wartime dramas showed soldiers grumbling about rations or leaders struggling with difficult choices. To the German POWs, this openness was shocking. Self-criticism had been forbidden in their world. Questioning authority was dangerous, and doubt was equated with betrayal. Yet here the Americans seemed to embrace it. Their democracy was not weakened by these admissions. It was strengthened. By allowing their people to see flaws and laugh at them, America appeared more confident, more resilient, and far more united than the rigid, brittle Reich. Some prisoners whispered that this was the true strength of democracy. It didn't need to pretend. It could afford honesty. It could expose its own weaknesses because it trusted that citizens would still fight for the larger ideals behind them. For men raised in a system where one mistake could be fatal, this kind of freedom felt revolutionary. The screenings meant simply to pass time, had become something far greater. They were lessons in democracy, projected in flickering black and white, reshaping how the prisoners understood both America and themselves. If the prisoners had been shaken by the idea of Americans mocking their own leaders, they were utterly stunned when the films showed who else was fighting the war. On the flickering screens, they saw women riveting steel plates in shipyards, welding seams on tanks, and assembling aircraft in vast hangars. They saw nurses braving frontline dangers, and women pilots ferrying new planes across the sky. The camera didn't treat them as background figures, it celebrated them as heroes of equal standing with soldiers at the front. In Germany, propaganda had confined women almost entirely to the home or to carefully staged appearances of traditional duty. The Nazi regime had insisted that the battlefield was for men and that women belonged only in service to family and state. To see America openly glorify women as builders of bombers, operators of machinery, and indispensable to victory was disorienting, almost offensive to the worldview they had been taught. And it wasn't only women. Films also showed African American soldiers training, marching, and serving in combat units. They saw depictions of Native Americans in uniform, Mexican American farm workers harvesting crops for the war effort, and Asian Americans working in factories. Though racism and inequality persisted in America, the message the POWs absorbed was simple but powerful. In this nation, minorities were part of the war machine, woven into the story of victory. For men who had been taught that racial purity was the essence of strength, the shock was profound. Here was a democracy that not only tolerated diversity but harnessed it, showing the world that victory could be achieved by drawing strength from men. In that darkened theater, the myths of Nazi superiority began to collapse, undone by the light of moving images that revealed another kind of power. If the sight of women building aircraft unsettled the prisoners, the images of racial and cultural diversity hit even harder. In German newsreels, minorities were invisible, erased from the story of the war. Strength, they were told, came from purity, but on the American screen, strength came from numbers, from the inclusion of all who could serve. They watched African American soldiers marching with determination, filmed alongside their white counterparts. They saw Hispanic farm workers feeding the vast American war machine, their labor celebrated as patriotic. Even Native American soldiers, descendants of tribes nearly wiped out in past centuries, were shown fighting under the same flag. To German eyes, this was an impossible contradiction. They had been assured that such diversity was weakness, yet here it was, presented as a source of unity and power. The more they watched, the more the contradictions cut deep. If America could field such a varied army and still win battles, what did that say about the Nazi worldview? If women could rivet steel and men of every background could march into victory, then the central pillar of their ideology, racial superiority, was nothing but smoke. For many of the POWs, this realization was more devastating than the sight of bombers or tanks. Weapons could be explained as technology. Industrial might could be chalked up to resources. But this was an idea, a belief system in direct opposition to the one they had been raised on, and it was working. The dark theater had become a mirror, forcing them to see not America's weakness, but their own illusions collapsing. By the time the reels ended, the prisoners walked back to their barracks in silence. For many, it was not the roar of American guns or the endless lines of tanks that broke them, but what they had just witnessed inside a simple camp theater. The realization settled like a weight on their chests. America's strength wasn't only material, it was cultural, even spiritual. They had been raised on the belief that unity meant sameness, that only a narrow vision of society could prevail. Yet here was a nation that laughed at its own leaders, showcased women as heroes, and celebrated minorities as part of its identity. This wasn't weakness, it was confidence, a kind of cultural security, so deep that it could afford to laugh, to include, to trust in freedom without fear of collapse. The German officers had no response for this. In their world, dissent was punished, difference was crushed, and propaganda papered over every crack. But what they saw on screen showed a society strong enough to expose its flaws and still stand tall. To men raised on iron discipline and fear of disobedience, this was as disorienting as any bombardment. Some POWs admitted later that this was the moment the war truly felt lost, not because of defeat on the battlefield, but because they saw an enemy whose strength came from within. An unshakable belief that democracy and openness were not vulnerabilities but weapons in their own right. For men whose entire worldview had been built on lies, this cultural confidence was the final crack in their armor. When Christmas approached, the camp atmosphere shifted again. The guards arranged a special screening in honor of the holiday. The projector flickered to life, showing not only festive American films, but also reels of children singing carols, snowy towns decorated with lights, and families gathering around trees. For men who had spent winters in cold barracks, with rations shrinking and fear of the front gnawing at them, the contrast was almost unbearable. But the real shock came when local communities extended their. In some small towns, church groups and civic clubs invited groups of prisoners into their halls for Christmas programs. They were not offered propaganda or lectures, but cookies baked by housewives, warm cocoa served in porcelain cups, and the sound of choirs filling the air with songs of peace. The prisoners sat stiffly at first, unsure if this was some trick. Yet as the evening went on, they felt the warmth of hospitality radiate through the room. No one spat insults. No one reminded them of their crime. Instead, they were treated as men who had simply been caught up in the storm of war. Later, some POWs would recall these evenings with tears in their eyes. The kindness was too much to bear, it pierced deeper than any interrogation. If America could show mercy during the very season of war, how could they cling to the vision of it as a decadent, soulless nation? For many, those Christmas gatherings became the moment they began to see their captors not as enemies, but as people, and in that recognition their own belief system cracked for good. The day the projectors rolled again, the atmosphere in the camp was different. This was no comedy, no holiday screening. It was a war documentary, raw and unflinching. The reels showed the Normandy landings, endless lines of ships stretching to the horizon, swarms of aircraft blotting out the sky, and columns of tanks rolling off landing craft like a mechanical time. For German prisoners, the images landed like body blows. They had been told that D-Day was a heroic defense, that the Reich had turned back waves of invaders with courage and sacrifice. But here in stark black and white, they saw the truth. The sheer scale of Allied power dwarfed anything they had ever imagined. They leaned forward, eyes wide, as American soldiers stormed beaches under withering fire, supported by naval guns larger than any they had ever known. Footage of supply ships unloading mountains of crates, fuel and ammunition showed a machine of war so vast that even German industry at its peak could not compare. Every frame made the myth of German superiority crumble further. Some prisoners whispered in disbelief, how could such resources even exist? Others sat in silence, ashamed, unable to reconcile their propaganda-fed certainty with the reality now projected before them. The arrogance of earlier years, the jokes about soft Americans evaporated in the face of an undeniable truth. They had fought a nation not only determined but industrially unstoppable. For many, this was the moment of true surrender. The battlefield was far away, but inside the camp theater, The war ended in their minds. No speech, no argument, no threat could have driven the point home more forcefully than those reels of ships, planes, and men advancing without end. When the lights dimmed again, the reels took a darker turn. This time the footage was not of beaches and tanks, but of barbed wire skeletal figures and hollow eyes staring through the lens. The Americans had spliced into the screenings evidence of the liberated concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, and other. The German prisoners shifted uneasily in their seats. Some averted their eyes. Others leaned forward as if straining to disbelieve what they were seeing. Emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms stumbled toward the cameras, too weak to speak. Rows of bodies lay stacked like firewood, a reality so grotesque that even seasoned soldiers felt their stomachs turn. For men who had been fed tales of enemy lies, the images were devastating. The camera did not flinch, did not embellish. It simply recorded, and in those frames, propaganda dissolved. The idea of fighting for a noble cause, of defending civilization against decadence, shattered under the weight of undeniable truth. Some whispered excuses, claims they had never known that this must have been the work of a few. But deep down, a silent reckoning began. They realized that the Reich they had fought for was not a shield of honor, but an empire of cruelty. When the lights came up, the silence in the hall was heavy. Guards didn't need to lecture. The film had done what no words could. It left the POWs not just militarily defeated but morally broken, staring into the collapse of everything they had once believed. When the war ended and ships carried prisoners back across the Atlantic, they carried more than their belongings. Many of them carried stories of nights spent in makeshift camp theaters, watching American films flicker on whitewashed walls. These tales became part of their personal testimony, woven into the larger memory of captivity. In Germany, where rubble still smoldered and cities lay hollowed out, former POWs described the shock of sitting in a barracks hall, handed popcorn or a cup of coffee, and watching Charlie Chaplin's antics or a John Wayne Western. They recounted how the Americans laughed freely, even at themselves, and how the movies revealed a society confident enough to show both triumphs and flaws on screen. For men raised in a regime where films were rigid, censored, and filled with slogans, this openness was unforgettable. Neighbors back home sometimes met these accounts with disbelief. How could enemies who had dropped bombs on their cities invite captured soldiers to watch comedies? Yet the stories persisted, told around dinner tables, in letters, and in veteran circles. The films became symbols of something greater than entertainment. They represented abundance, freedom, and a confidence rooted not in fear but in democracy. Over time, these memories helped soften attitudes. Children of those POWs grew up hearing that America was not only powerful, but unexpectedly humane. In a Europe rebuilding from ashes, such recollections planted seeds of respect, of admiration, and in some cases, of longing for a world where a man could laugh without fear of censors watching. Long after the war, the memory of those screenings lingered. For the German prisoners, the movies they watched in captivity became more than fleeting entertainment. They became symbols of a society fundamentally different from the one they had served. In every reel of film, democracy projected its confidence. America did not need to hide behind slogans or silences. It allowed laughter, criticism, even self-mockery to play openly on screen. For men who had been raised in a system where every frame of cinema was a weapon of propaganda, this was shocking. Yet it was also liberating. The very act of letting prisoners see American films spoke volumes. Strength did not come from control but from freedom. The guards did not lecture them about democracy. Instead, the screen showed it in action. Diversity appeared not only in the characters, but in the genres themselves. Comedies, romances, newsreels, and war dramas, all testifying to a culture unafraid of contradiction. When those POWs returned home, the stories spread quietly across Europe. They told of how their captors had offered them not only food and shelter, but windows into another world. In the fractured post-war landscape, these recollections shaped perceptions of America as a place where abundance and openness went hand in hand. The legacy of those screenings was larger than the camps themselves. They illustrated how soft power through cinema, culture, and ideas could achieve what weapons alone never could: the transformation of belief. To many, the memory of watching a simple comedy in an American camp remained a turning point, proof that true strength was not in fortresses or armies, but in the freedom to imagine, to laugh, and to question.